Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for day 2 of my Halloween mystery week. Today I'm covering a case which I've actually never seen anybody else on YouTube cover, and honestly I can't believe that nobody else is talking about this because it is just mind-boggling. On the 4th of December 2005, the body of 30-year-old Annie Börjesson is found washed up on a beach in Scotland. It was officially ruled a suicide by the Scottish authorities, although a lot of people do dispute this. After she was found, a local newspaper prints a report of what had happened. It says, an area of Prestwick beach was cordoned off at the weekend after a woman's body was found washed up on the shore. A dog walker discovered the 30-year-old woman's body at 8:30 AM on Sunday near Maryborough Road. A police investigation team quickly sealed off the area, but there are no suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. In actuality, her body was found near Grandmere Road and not Maryborough Road. And also it's quite strange that just the next day, the newspaper is already reporting that there's no suspicious circumstances around this. The police were very quick to say there was nothing suspicious here whatsoever. At this point, the post-mortem hadn't even been completed yet. Annie Christina Börjesson was born in 1975 in her home country of Sweden. She was 30 years old when she died, 5'6" with blue eyes and long, thick blonde hair down past her waist. She was generally quite a happy person. She loved to be on stage, she loved to perform, and she was also a gifted linguist. She spoke so many languages, including Swedish, obviously, English, French, Finnish and Hungarian. She didn't do drugs and she wasn't that much of a heavy drinker either. Annie hit her late 20s and decided that she wanted more of a challenge in life, and so she moves to Scotland in order to practice her English. She lived in Edinburgh, and for what I could find, she moved quite a lot back between Scotland and Sweden over the last couple of years of her life. In the autumn of 2004, she moved to Scotland for the first time in order to practice her English, and then moved back to Sweden. She then returns back to Scotland in February of 2005, where she has a scholarship at the Scotch Whisky Heritage Centre. In August of 2005, she moves back to Sweden for a couple of months, and then again back to Scotland, where she's looking for a new job. Even though Annie was unemployed, her family are pretty sure that she wasn't exactly short of money. She wasn't having any financial problems whatsoever. While she was searching for a job in Scotland, she was receiving benefits from Sweden. Whenever she was back in Sweden, she was living with her parents, and so she was saving money that way. In the days before she died, Annie paid the next month's rent for all of December on her apartment. She'd lived in the same apartment block, the Linden Court Apartments, for most of her stays in Scotland. She had her own room, so her own space, but she had a communal living and kitchen area for everyone to congregate. In the days before she died as well, she went to the doctors where she got an injection, and she also took out a membership for her local leisure centre because she wanted to swim more. She was a very strong swimmer, and so now she was intending to stay in Scotland for the long term. She took out a membership so she could go as much as she wanted to. In the days leading up to December 3rd, Annie was acting a little bit strangely, but you could only really notice it in hindsight. At the time, nobody thought she was acting odd, but looking back, people were like, yeah, that was a bit of an odd thing for her to say or odd thing for her to do. One of her flatmates reported that Annie was slightly depressed, possibly due to a man, although she wasn't in a relationship with anybody. Annie also said to one of her flatmates that she had to take care of something and that she was about to make a decision that was going to change her life. Very ominous now we know what's happened to her. Nobody knows what she was talking about. And it is ominous now in retrospect, but honestly, she could have been talking about anything. She could have been given a job offer and was deciding whether to accept it or not. She could be deciding whether to start a new relationship or move back to Sweden. It doesn't have to be something dark. On the day before she died, the 2nd of December 2005, Annie decides to go back to her old workplace at the Scotch Whisky Heritage Centre so she can have a catch up with an old friend. The friend she met up with there was a girl called Kat, and Kat said that Annie was acting completely normal. Nothing was strange at all. They had a regular catch up, but then her mood changed a little bit when she received a call from her mother. Now, Annie's mother was a woman called Börjesson, and she's been fighting ever since her daughter's death to right all the wrongs. She wants to get justice for her daughter. She doesn't believe that she committed suicide, and so a lot of the information I have comes directly from Guya's own words. So she said she called Annie that day because Annie had recently spoken to her brother and her dad, and both of them said that she seemed very down, a little bit depressed, and Guya was worried. So she gives her a call. Guya says that she's quizzing Annie on what's wrong, and Annie simply says, "You have to respect this, but I have to take care of myself." Guya replies, "Okay, but call me tonight or tomorrow." And Annie says, "Well, we'll see about that. A very strange conversation to have with your mother, and Kat said that Annie's entire demeanour changed after this conversation. Strangely though, after Annie died, they obviously looked into all her phone records, and the police said that this particular call was not registered as received or made or anything on Annie's phone. It just didn't exist, even though both Guya and Kat have said that Annie definitely did receive this phone call. Actually, according to the police, there were absolutely no incoming or outgoing calls on Annie's phone in the last 3 days of her life, even though multiple people say that they spoke to her. Earlier that week, on the 27th of November, Annie had called her best friend back home in Sweden, a woman called Maria, and they'd spoken on the phone for an hour. There's no record of this call either. It's not on Annie's mobile or on her landline. The only possible explanation is that Annie could have gone outside her apartment block and used the payphone. The payphone was sometimes cheaper to call across seas than her mobile phone would have been. But still, it's just very strange that there's no record of this again. Between 6 and 8 PM on December the 2nd, Annie has another phone call with a different friend back in Sweden, and this friend says that Annie said she was going to a party that night at 10 PM, but she didn't give any other details than that, just that she was quite excited to go out to this party. No one has ever come forward with any information about this party. No one ever said they saw Annie. We just don't know any information about it at all. In fact, nobody really knows anything about Annie's life in Edinburgh. I briefly mentioned earlier that Annie may have been having boy trouble, so I figured I'd touch on that a little bit more here. Now, nobody has been able to talk about a specific man. Annie didn't have a boyfriend. Nobody knew if she was seeing anybody, but she did mention in passing that she was having boy trouble, therefore there must have been someone. Annie very much had a type. She was into rugby guys pretty much exclusively. She often socialised at the nearby Murrayfield Rugby Club, where she'd talk to people, talk to rugby players, and she'd have a few drinks. Now, one night she goes to a nightclub called Mood in Edinburgh. Now, this actually said that she went alone, which I find a little bit strange. And in this club, she meets a man who's claiming to be Martin Leslie. Now, Martin Leslie is apparently quite a well-known New Zealand rugby player, but this guy obviously wasn't him. The real Martin Leslie was not in Scotland at the time. So either this guy just took a chance by pretending to be this rugby player and hit on the right girl who was very much into rugby players, or he kind of knew Annie beforehand and knew what she would be attracted to. This guy kept insisting on buying Annie a drink, and he kept saying no, she didn't want a drink, but they did carry on chatting for hours. Apparently they were together talking all night. But then a few days before her death, Annie's swimming at a local leisure centre and a man turns up. Now, I really don't have much information I can give you surrounding this encounter. All I know is that Annie felt quite uncomfortable about this man turning up while she was swimming. I don't know if this is the same guy who pretended to be Martin Leslie. I don't know if it's a different guy. Honestly, there's really not much information surrounding this. Perhaps it was the guy that she'd been talking to in Mood that night. Maybe she mentioned in passing that she swam at this leisure centre and he decided to come and see her, which is just a very, very strange thing to do. And it's got to be said as well, there is absolutely nothing that links this guy, we don't even know who this guy is, to Annie's death. There's nothing there. But it's just a very strange thing to happen just a few days before she ends up dying. The 3rd of December is Annie's last day, and the timeline of events is really, really strange here. No one is entirely sure why she made the movements that she did. A cleaner at Annie's apartment recalls seeing her there about 1:15 PM. However, Annie was shown to be in central Glasgow using a cash point just after 2 PM. These timings just don't coincide, they don't work together, because there is basically no way that Annie could have got from Edinburgh to central Glasgow in that amount of time. Annie caught the trains pretty much everywhere. She lived 2 miles from her closest station, which was Haymarket. Now, the train from Haymarket to Glasgow takes about an hour, some of them about 54 minutes, some of them could be an hour and 10 minutes, but around the hour mark. And that's according to the Trainlines app now. Of course, this did happen in 2005, so the trains may have been slightly quicker or slightly slower. But I'm going to assume that the timings haven't really changed much in 13 years. And this hour-long train journey isn't even allowing for the walk from Annie's apartment to Haymarket station, and again from the Glasgow station to the cash point in Central. A journey by car would also be highly unlikely in this time, although it would maybe be possible, but you've got to remember that this was a Saturday, about 3 weeks before Christmas, so both Edinburgh and Glasgow, major shopping cities, would have been absolutely rammed. It wouldn't shock me if it took her an hour just to drive out of Edinburgh alone. So bearing all of that in mind, it probably makes sense that the cleaner was a little bit mistaken about her times. Maybe she saw Annie half an hour earlier than she said. Annie likely would have caught the 1 PM-ish train from Haymarket, which would have arrived in Glasgow just before 2 PM. She walks to the cash point and tries to get money out at about 2:15 PM, and she actually tries twice to get money out, and both times her card is declined due to insufficient funds. The first time she tries to get out 100 and the second time 50 before she gives up. She then boards another train, this time from Glasgow Central towards Prestwick International Airport. Once she's at the airport, she walks over the overhead walkway and into the terminal building, and she's smoking the entire time. This is the first time that she's caught on CCTV throughout her entire journey. Although, to be honest, the rest of the journey probably would have had CCTV, but the police never requested any of it. Now, Prestwick Airport wouldn't have been just a random destination for Annie. She knew this journey well. Whenever she wanted to fly back home to Sweden, she'd go to Prestwick and catch a Ryanair flight back to her hometown. So this is a journey she would have taken many, many times. Now, once she arrives at the airport, she walks out of the terminal. She walks into the short stay car park, and she's outside for about 3 minutes. Now, her family were later told by police that she went outside to try and look for a cash point, but there is no cash point outside, and surely she would have known that she'd be more lucky to find one inside the terminal building than outside in a random car park. It's more likely, to be honest, that she just went outside for a breather. She's been on busy trains for the last hour and a half and wanted some fresh air. There's CCTV that shows her walking back into the terminal building, and a friend said that she actually looks really annoyed when she walks back in. Something has pissed her off. After Annie returns back into the terminal, the timestamps on CCTV showed that she managed to walk the entire length of the terminal in 55 seconds. Later on, investigators went back to the terminal to see if this was possible, if she could walk the entire length in 55 seconds. But they saw, on average, it would take about 1 minute and 35 seconds. So for Annie to move this distance, it's likely that she would have been running it, even though none of the CCTV actually shows her running. And then she leaves the terminal building. After spending 2 hours and 15 minutes travelling to Prestwick Airport, she only spends 4 minutes and 41 seconds inside it. The police said that her next move was to walk the mile into Prestwick town. She would have walked down the length of a dual carriageway. Family are pretty certain that she'd never visited Prestwick town before, so this was just very, very odd. The next possible CCTV footage of Annie comes from Prestwick town. She's walking down a road called Station Road. And this is around 4:05 PM, but there has been a lot of dispute as to whether the person in the footage is Annie or not. It's really, really poor quality. It kind of looks like the same height as Annie, and it looks like somebody carrying quite a heavy bag as Annie was, but you can't actually tell if it's her or not. But this possible sighting of her on Station Road backs up the next possible sighting of her, which was a woman or a male, they don't even know the gender, on the beach. And this would have been around 4:30 PM. A man is walking down the promenade and sees a person stood on the beach about 130-ish metres out. 20 minutes later, he walks back in the same direction and again sees this person still standing there. And he actually makes a comment to his friend saying like, oh, I hope they're not going to hurt themselves, but then doesn't really think much more of it. And then the next day he's walking down the same promenade and sees that the entire area has been cordoned off by police. And so he mentions to a nearby officer what he saw the previous day. And this is what cinched it for the police. Annie had taken her own life. And you can see why they think this, but in reality they had no reason to think that this figure this man saw on the beach, which could have been male or female, was Annie. But for them, it all matched up. Annie leaving the terminal building, walking into the town, being seen possibly on Station Road, and then being seen on the beach 15 minutes later. It had to be her. So Annie's body was found on the morning of December 4th, 2005, and she'd actually been washed up quite high up the beach, just by the seawall. She was found lying on her back, and nearby her body they found her bags and her coat. The body was quickly identified as Annie, and the autopsy was conducted. Now, the autopsy was actually a very, very interesting read, but I'm just going to round up some of the more important points here for you. So the body was contaminated by sand and seaweed. She was just covered in sand and seaweed. She had a white, clear, frothy fluid coming from her mouth, and this fluid was also found in her lungs and in her air passage. It notes that her hair is long and also heavily contaminated with sand and seaweed. She had pale depressions on her forehead and her nose, which it notes that could be a result of the body lying on something when it was found, but Annie wasn't lying on anything when she was found. She was actually found on her back. So what were these pale sort of spots on her face. It was on the side of her nose and on her forehead. She had no bruising or any kind of abnormality in her genital region, showing that she wasn't raped or assaulted. Both of her lungs were congested with small hemorrhages, and she did have external bruising, but not that much, and the autopsy said it was most likely caused by her sort of hitting on things in the sea. There was no evidence of her receiving any trauma before her death. They plucked some of her hairs to test for forensic, and they didn't retain any of her organs. Their final opinion was death due to drowning. However, they don't put any estimate of time of death on there, which is quite strange, and they also don't take any guess as to whether it was suicide, accident or murder. She had no drugs in her system, and she had a blood alcohol level of 0.02, so she likely had had an alcoholic drink maybe that day or late the night before, which would make sense if she was at a party. But she wasn't drunk at all. She wasn't even above the legal drink driving limit. They never took any samples of the water from Annie's lungs to determine if it was fresh water or salt water. The sea in which they said Annie drowned in was salt water. In 2010, a forensic pathologist from the US agreed to look at Annie's autopsy report, and he actually said there was a limited amount he could do with what he had because they'd filled out the autopsy report really poorly. He said that it was inadequate and not quite up to the US usual standards. He did note that a particular algae that was usually associated with fresh water was recovered from Annie's bone marrow. Now, I don't know much about biology, so I really can't tell you how strange this is. A lot of the articles I read online really do seem to hold on to this, that this algae that's usually found in fresh water was found in her bone marrow. But Annie likely wouldn't have been in the salt water for long, so could algae really penetrate into her bone marrow after she drowned? And she'd probably not been in the water for more than a few hours, if that. Would this have anything to do with her death? Would it have just been some kind of freak thing, maybe from her drinking fresh water? I really don't know. If there's any scientists out there, then I'll leave that question to you. Now, I mentioned earlier near Annie's body they found her coat and her 2 bags. But a lot of people think it's very strange that they all washed up so close together because they obviously all had different weights, and so the sea would have taken some things out further and then washed them up in different places. They just said it was very strange that they all washed up so nearby. Annie was also fully clothed apart from a fleece she was wearing and her coat which washed up nearby. Now, they actually didn't notice the fleece until months later when they saw on the security footage that she was wearing it. I think it was white and red. And they've never found this fleece. Did Annie take it off on the beach somewhere? Did somebody pick it up? Did it get washed away? Nobody really knows. And this isn't the only thing that's never been found. Annie's Filofax also disappeared. Now, Annie was a type A personality. She was so organised, and her Filofax was her entire life. Everything went into this. And she always had it on her, no matter where she went, whether she was at the club or just doing her shopping. She would always have her Filofax in her bag. So it's very strange that when they opened up the bag, it wasn't in there. For the family, this was the first sign that something was amiss, the fact that the police couldn't find this Filofax. And to be honest, if the police and Annie's family did have the Filofax, they'd probably have a lot clearer idea of her life in Scotland, who she hung out with, if she was seeing anybody, where she sort of socialised. But honestly, they just don't really know these facts, which makes it really difficult to really look into Annie's life. While searching for any information about her daughter that she can, Guya logs into Annie's Hotmail account, but when she opens the account, there's no emails in there. It has been completely wiped. Now, I don't know if this is just the type of person Annie was. Maybe Annie just religiously cleared out her email. I know people who do this, they like to have nothing in their inbox whatsoever. And it wouldn't shock me if Annie was the type to keep a Filofax. Maybe she was a serial deleter. But Guya says she thought it was strange. Had Annie done it on purpose before she took this trip to Prestwick, or had somebody else done it for her? And Maria also noticed something very strange. So she calls up her phone company in Sweden to get a record of all the phone calls between herself and Annie in the months before she died. But the phone company had no records. They didn't have a single one of these calls in their archive. And not only did they not have any record of them, not a single one of these calls was ever charged to either Maria or Annie. So where did they go? Now, Annie's body is actually extradited to Sweden 9 days later, and when her family see her body, they notice that she is missing huge amounts of hair. Her hair had been cut sort of 15 to 30 centimetres from her head, all sort of roughly chopped up. And like I mentioned before, Annie had beautiful, long, thick, waist-length hair, not dissimilar to mine, but obviously blonde. And her family have never been able to find out where her hair went. In the autopsy in Scotland, they note that her hair is long, and they say they took a few strands for testing, but they don't mention at all that they cut it. After her body was in Scotland, it was taken down to London for a couple of days before it was then taken back to Sweden. So it's likely that while she was in London, for some reason, somebody cut all her hair off. This is such a little thing, but for me, I see why her family would be so upset about it, because often your hair is a big part of somebody's identity, and Annie was known for her long, thick, beautiful hair. I know that if I died and somebody cut off all my hair, obviously I'd be dead, but I would be so angry because my hair is such a precious thing to me, and I can't even begin to imagine how annoyed Annie's family were about this. Like, after everything that happened to her, she just loses that tiny last bit of dignity. Her family get another pathologist to look over her body while she's in Sweden, and this pathologist noticed that she had a lot more bruising than the autopsy in Scotland said. She was covered in bruises. So now let's talk about some theories. There's no doubt that Annie did drown. They found the water in her lungs. She definitely drowned. But was it suicide? Was it an accident? Or was it murder? Let's start by talking about the suicide theory, which is the police's official cause of death. The police went to Edinburgh and spoke to a few of her friends and her flatmates, who all said that she seemed a little bit down and a little bit depressed. They saw her strange actions at the airport and the man who reported seeing a lone figure stood on the beach. They put two and two together and came up with suicide. She was also clearly having some kind of money troubles, even though her family are reluctant to believe this. She couldn't take the money out of her account. She didn't even have £50 in there. But she had reportedly either recently gotten a job or she was on the verge of being offered one. So if she was having money troubles and she decides to kill herself for this, it doesn't really make sense, as she was on the brink of starting work. And her family also say that when they went back to her flat in Edinburgh, they found a cheque in there for £300. So she did have money. She did have access to it. It just seems strange that she never actually banked this. And the police also have absolutely no proof that anybody else was involved. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that another person was with Annie at any point. And so for them, suicide just seems like the most obvious option here. Now, this happened in 2005 when mental health issues were very much brushed under the carpet, or more so than they are now. So it is possible that Annie may have been suffering with worse mental health than she let on to anybody, and she did commit suicide, but again, her family just don't really believe this. It's not completely out of the question that she committed suicide. It's very much possible. There are a lot of questions surrounding it, things that just don't really make sense. For starters, if you're going to commit suicide, why travel 80 miles to Prestwick to commit suicide in a town on a beach that you've never been to before? There are a lot of easier ways to do it, let alone the fact that committing suicide by drowning is pretty much the hardest way to commit suicide that there is. Your body is determined to survive. No matter how much you want to die, your body automatically tries to float, tries to keep you alive. And Annie was a strong swimmer, so she's even less likely to die from drowning. But then again, there are the ominous words that she said to her mother: "I have to take care of myself." What did she mean by this? And then there's a theory that it was possibly an accident. So let's say Annie travels all the way to Prestwick Airport. Either she intended to catch a flight home to Sweden, or maybe she was meeting up with somebody there. Both of them are very, very likely. Either she can't afford the flight, or whoever she's meeting doesn't turn up. She feels sad and decides to walk into Prestwick town. Aguya has visited the beach and the exact location where Annie was found, and she said that she finds it unlikely that Annie could have died accidentally here. She said that she walked out into the sea about 220 metres, and even at that point it was only up to her knees. And so how far would Annie have had to have walked out for it to accidentally take her under? But again, this was years later. We don't really know the tidal charts for that day. I'd be very interested to see the charts if you can find them anywhere online. I know that some people online have seen them, but I really struggle to find them. Maybe the sea was particularly rough that day. How far would Annie have had to have walked out to accidentally drown? The man said he saw her about 150 metres out. If the sea was rough, then it is likely that she was taken off her feet and taken underneath. Maybe she hit her head on a rock as she was taken down. This to me does seem the most likely option in this case, because if she was conscious, then she was strong enough to swim out of it. But this wasn't a summer's day, it wasn't hot, and you don't think, oh, I'm going to go take a dip in the sea. This was in the middle of winter. It was December, it was Scotland. It likely would have been near freezing temperatures, and so why would Annie walk fully clothed into the sea? And also, a lot of the suicide and accident theories are based on the fact this man did see a figure out on the beach. But there's a possibility that this wasn't Annie at all. Eventually, Scotland closes the case. For them, it was cut and dry, suicide, no other options here. but her family are convinced that she was murdered. They think she was murdered elsewhere and later placed on the beach. They think she was too far up on the beach by the seawall and the tide most likely wouldn't have brought her that far up. And they also say it's strange that her belongings were found so nearby to her. Again, if we had the tidal charts here, we could see if it was possible if the tide did go up that high, but like I said, I really can't find them. Again, there is no doubt that she was murdered. She definitely drowned. She had water in her lungs. And I find it unlikely that somebody would drown her in a different location and then take her back to the beach and put her there. I think if she was murdered by somebody who approached her on the beach that day. Is it possible that she travelled to Prestwick to meet someone in particular? Maybe she went out into the short stay car park because she had plans for somebody to pick her up. Who this person was, nobody has any idea. When this person doesn't turn up in the car park, Annie decides to take matters into her own hand and walk into the town to find them. Was it maybe this mysterious rugby guy impersonator? Was it somebody completely different? We'll never really know. If this is the case, then this person probably is the one who killed her. But again, like I said before, there's very little evidence that another person was actually involved in this. But then again, the police never looked into this as a crime. They said in the local newspaper the next day that there was no suspicious activity involved. So maybe it was suspicious, maybe something did happen, but the police just never looked into it. Would they have found something if they were actually looking? In 2007, her family found out that DNA was actually found on Annie's hand, DNA belonging to another person. And apparently if Annie was in the sea, this DNA would have washed away pretty quickly. Either somebody touched her body and left DNA after she was dead, or she was in the sea for such a little amount of time that this tiny piece of DNA on her hand didn't wash away. And then there's an interesting, possible crazy theory for the murder, but you'll have to admit it kind of makes sense. A lot of people think that the CIA was involved. Annie's full name was Annie Christina Börjesson, very similar to the name of an American journalist, Christina Börjesson. Now, Christina was actually investigating rendition flights going through Prestwick Airport. Now, rendition flights are, in a very brief nutshell, transfer flights of one person, usually a criminal, from the US to a different country where different laws are in place. For example, torture isn't illegal. Now, the US completely denies that they do this. They say they never do rendition flights and they never transfer prisoners out of the US, especially for means of torture. But it does happen. People transfer out, they get interrogated, they get tortured, and the US are able to get information out of them that way. And Christina Börjesson was looking into these flights coming out of Prestwick Airport. Is it possible that the CIA wanted to stop Christina and she was their target, but instead they get Annie? This could all be very easily explained by a case of mistaken identity. It would explain why there was no evidence of another person there, because this was a professional hit. But would Annie have known they were after her? Highly, highly unlikely. Did she just get so unlucky that one day she ends up in Prestwick and the CIA are also there looking to murder another woman with a very similar name? That is the one thing I have problems with here. If she was murdered, it seems professional and it would make sense they would take her file of facts away. It makes sense that her phone records would be wiped, and it makes sense that her emails would be wiped as well. I'm not 100% sure where I stand on this case. I have my theory as to why Annie went to Prestwick Airport. I think she intended to go home to Sweden for Christmas to surprise her family. I think that's why when her mother said, "I'll speak to you tomorrow," or "call me tomorrow," Annie said, "Well, we'll see about that," because she knew she was going back home the next day. Annie did have a hairdresser's appointment booked with the hairdressers in Sweden that following Monday. She had library books with her, which were due to be returned back to a library in Sweden. So I think she fully intended to travel to Prestwick, book a last minute flight. There was a flight at 6:30 p.m. that night. And I think she intended to get onto that flight, but when she arrived in Glasgow, she realised that she didn't have any money. Maybe she realised she'd forgotten to cash that cheque, and so when she arrived at Prestwick Airport, she walks into the terminal, goes outside for a breather, comes back in and just thinks, you know what, I'm going to the beach, I need to clear my head. What happened from there on out, I really don't know. Maybe she did commit suicide, maybe it was an accident, maybe it was a murder. I really don't know about that part. I'm just pretty sure that Annie went to the airport with the intention of getting on a flight. I think the Scottish authorities did mess up by not fully looking into the case. I think they were very quick to rule it a suicide, and now maybe out of a kind of pride thing can't reopen the case, even though there is evidence that maybe it wasn't a suicide. I just definitely think they missed a lot of details in this. The family are trying to get the authorities in Scotland to release some of Annie's body tissue for further tests, but the Scottish authorities are actually refusing to do this, which is just another layer of weird. The family are still fighting to get the inquiry reopened. They want a complete, full criminal investigation into it, but honestly now 13 years later, I don't think they'd find anything even if they did open it again. I am so intrigued to hear all of your theories on this. Why do you think Annie went to Prestwick? What do you think happened to her? Do you think there's anything that I may have missed? I can't wait to hear all of your opinions, and I will see you in tomorrow's video. Bye guys.